It was my job to care for my fat brother and my fatter sister-in-law as they slowly ate themselves to death. I went to live with them once it became impossible for either one to leave their house. At the time, they weighed a combined 1,913 pounds. Opening the front door was, at that point, the worst experience of my life. That record would go on to be topped many times in the ensuing days. The smell? Oh my god, the smell was unbearable. It caressed me in a slow lick and I vomited immediately into the front hallway. I quickly lost sight of my puke and the mess on the floor. My clothes were instantly ruined and I spent every night in the doghouse out back, despite the freezing temperatures. I never changed my clothes because the smell had desecrated them and there was no point in destroying any more. Besides, I couldn't even detect my own B.O. Gorp and Rena sat together in the corner of their bedroom, both far too fat to wear any clothes. In the beginning, I tried to give them sponge baths. Ow, you fucker, Gorp yelled as he hit me with a massive tree trunk of an arm. While his muscles were weak, the sheer momentum of a 100-pound appendage was enough to blast dizzying shockwaves of pain through my head and send me sprawling onto the infested ground. I rolled over immediately, not wanting to breathe in the particular matter that had collected on the floor. I sat up quickly. Why'd you do that, Gorp? I spat angrily. His greasy hair obscured much of his face, making his reaction hard to read. I could tell that he was pulling his head back in disgust, since his face had collapsed against his skin so that it was flush with his chest. Gorp raised an arm and showed me. My mouth watered in the way that precipitates all vomit, and I felt dizzy once more. My furious scrubbing had ruptured a slab of malnourished skin, which sloughed off and was now hanging like a festering dingleberry. Layers of fat had burst through the opening as though they had longed for escape. As I watched, the cut slowly creeped open, wider and wider, a fraction of an inch at a time. Yellowy white lard slid out into the open like a slow-motion whale breaching the water for much-needed air. You need to get to a hospital, I gasped. He threw the half-full bedpan at me. It clanged against my skull and spilled its contents into my hair, deep in my ears and down my neck, soaking my shirt. The stench of the house was so strong that I didn't smell a thing. You need to get me another pizza, you dick, he screeched, each of his 7 chins jiggling even more than the last. Rena giggled, which alerted me to her own thrown bedpan. I ducked. It soared through the window and landed on the sidewalk. Leave it! She screamed. You can clean my mess directly off the floor! I started to cry. It doesn't have to be like this. Obesity doesn't make you bad people. There are plenty of housebound sufferers who have wonderful hearts. Gorp punched his hand through the wall, sending a cascade of plaster and ants to the floor. My size doesn't make me who I am. I make me who I am. Just like you're a little piece of shit because you chose to be a little piece of shit. He flashed a toothless smile. Rena chortled. The tears were rolling down my soiled face. You're going to die, Gorp. What do you want? He stared at me, black beady eyes barely visible through his greasy hair. Finally, he nodded and looked at Rena. He reached his pudgy sausage fingers out to her, and she scrambled to find his. But their girth prevented such a union. Instead, she rested a hand on one of his flesh rolls. A ripple radiated outward along the surface of his fat. She smiled. It's time, Gorp! He hitched a sob. I love every ounce of you. With that, he pitched forward, rolling like cake batter down a hill. His face collided with her fat. She repeated this motion, so that each of their heads buried in each other's flesh. With a crunch like apples, both began to chew. Blood and fat filled their mouths, body leaks turning into sprays. Each gobbled the other hungrily as their flesh turned into food. Rena looked at me with red teeth and smiled. I ran out of the house and never came back. I was never able to give either one a proper burial because no remains could positively discern. When the coroner arrived at the house, all she could find was a room filled with 18 inches high with gelatinous viscera. Dreams, indeed, are ambition, for the very substance of the ambitious is merely the shadow of a dream. I hold ambition of so airy and light, a quality that is but a shadow's shadow. Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 2, 257-62. We word worship the bard for a damn good reason. No one else has been able to say a better sense. Ambition and success are usually sugar-coated and mass-produced for dishonest purpose at the end of a Disney movie. True ambition is a rare thing that comes from the part of a man's spirit that evolution has long protected via the cloak of profound stupidity and soul-crushing apathy. I was one of the rare ones. I was willing. Corporate success begins with 100-hour work weeks, but it doesn't end there, not by a long shot. When Lionel Creckens himself asked me into his office to talk things over, I could actually taste my ambition bearing fruit. "Have a seat, Mr. Walker," he offered. Creckens extended a pudgy hand out in front of him, reaching over his ample torso girth. He flashed white teeth as he smiled. I sat. The man poured himself a double of a 1913 Patty Centauri. He offered me none. Sally Henson spent 6 months crunching numbers for subtleties in the diversities market. Creckens droned casually. Andrew Hess brought on 3 new corporations as subsidiaries, and Lou Brish took Hanson's information and used it to sell to Hess clients at a substantial profit. Yet all 3 resigned in the past month, just before the deals were publicized, and you ended up with all the credit. My balls froze. Creckens began a deep, guttural guffle that broke down into a series of vortex-like wheezing gasps. He was very fat. He caught his breath and stared at me with his beady eyes, then rose to his feet and rested his weight on his fist. "And you made it seem like you were their friends even after they were gone?" His comb-over flopped down in front of his eyes. He did not move it. "I'm proud of you, Mr. Walker. The truly evolved person makes that extra grab for personal glory." I breathed a sigh of relief. He understood. Of course he did. Then Creckens turned around and pulled a girl out from his closet. She was naked, save for the ropes on her wrists and ankles, and a hood over her face. Nice body and perky tits, to be perfectly honest. She seemed terrified, but it was hard to tell if the hood. "$7 million to take her while I watch," Creckens said, unzipping his pants. The bound woman lurched back but was unable to run away. I was overwhelmed with vertigo. $7 million. More than any honest man would ever need. Enough to satiate even the ambitious. And would I really say no to Creckens? "Don't worry," he heaved. "I will have her disposed of when you're finished, if you so desire." I felt so hollow when it was over. I vaguely considered that she must feel so much worse. A supremely satisfied Lionel Creckens zipped up his pants, walked over to the girl and smiled. I really did feel awful for her. When he started peeling back her hood, my initial thought was that I didn't want to see her face. My world ended when I recognized my daughter lying on the ground. She looked up and saw me for all I ever would be. "So?" Creckens asked, pulling a 9 mil from his coat pocket. "Do you still want to dispose of the evidence?" Have you tasted nihilism? Designer drugs sweep through my neighborhoods like the flu. Evolution is constant. Each new pharmaceutical iteration tests its mettle with the delicious mortality of tragic idiots. Evolution seeks perfection. This time, I suspect, it may have gotten things right. I've been a beat cop in the shitty neighborhood of Carbondale, Illinois for 19 years, 13 days. At a certain point, you need to quantify things to make sure pieces of yourself don't get lost. Or at the very least, you count the days to keep track of how quickly you're dying. But nihilism moved too quickly to keep track. 3 days ago, I was called in for a wellness check at a sad apartment building. It was overcast. It was unlocked. A swarm of flies burst from the room as soon as I opened the door. The stench followed it. It was not an overpowering smell, but it spoke of neglect and cat food. I walked into the living room and announced myself. Almost immediately, I saw the bare legs poking out from around the kitchen corner, and I drew my gun. No matter how many bodies I found over the years, it never gets easier. I radioed for backup, then crept around the corner with my service weapon drawn. Inch by inch, the body came into view. The legs were gray. There was no way to tell the ethnicity or gender. Blue veins were visible beneath the translucent skin. The buttocks emerged next. I realized that the person must have been there for some time before death, because their ass was rifled with fecal matter. What appeared to be a water stain lay beneath their pelvis. It turned out to be the result of a urine saturation. Approximately 3 gallons had been absorbed into the floor. God knows how long that took. The flies had been centered around the excess feces, which covered much of the floor in addition to coating the buttocks. I had to walk through the swarm in order to reach the victim's head. I nearly slipped in the liquid shit that I couldn't see through the flies. I later threw those shoes in the trash. The floor actually got worse the more I saw of it. Huge swaths were black with slick mold. I nearly fell once again and steadied myself by grabbing the counter. My hand landed in goo. It was far too warm for an abandoned house. I didn't want to know what it was, so I shook my hand dry and didn't look at it. Creeping along the body, I was able to look into the victim's upper torso and arms, or what was left of them. The arm was festering, open wound. The ground mold had crept along its gray skin and spilled into the gash. It was impossible to tell how much skin was missing. Contrasting with the black mold was a cornucopia of blossoming white pus. Up and down his arm was a garden of slick putrescence. It seemed to battle the mold for space. Growing on the victim's gray back was a furry substance that took me several seconds to identify as moss. Heart pumping and stomach churning, I bent down to look at the corpse's face. Its pale blue eyes were almost white. They were wide-eyed and staring. The hair was brittle and thin, but I did not think I was witnessing the effects of male-pattern baldness. The mouth was open, and the lips were floating in a stagnant pit of drool. All of its teeth, except for one upper incisor, were gone. Then, it grabbed my leg. I turned to run, slipped into liquid horror, and cracked my skull on the counter. I landed face first on the unholy floor. Mold and shit and flies soaked into my open, festering wound. I screamed, stood up too fast, and face planted onto the dirty ass crack. I was finally able to get myself and run, sobbing into the corner of the room. Just as backup burst through the door, I was disoriented, injured, bleeding, hysterical, and crying. One of the cops reached over to the deadbeat's table and grabbed a bottle. He quickly removed one of the pills and popped it into my mouth. Nihilism. The guy on the floor had been in the same spot for God knows how long. The drug erased everything in his mind, and he was content simply laying flat without any movement as long as he was high. No matter how much mold or pus or living things swarmed his body. And I get it. The pill that cop gave me took everything away. I simply didn't give a shit about anything bad or good after that. I got out of the hospital last week. I haven't gone back to work since coming home, and I don't care. I got some of the nihilism. It's beyond power and wonder. It is all I want. This message will serve as a reminder that I lived. Now, I'm going to grab 7 bottles of pills, and I'm going to find a spot on the floor. It was a pleasure to burn through so many women. I don't know how I could do it. Time travel was a gift, and one that I used to its fullest potential. I neither knew nor cared whence it came. It could have been genetic, but I never knew my piece of shit father. Mom was a good enough person, and the only woman I ever respected. The rest? They deserved what they got. The thing about time travel is that it was space travel as well. When I was 15 and naked in the shower, suddenly appearing at a stranger's Thanksgiving dinner 7 years in the past with my hair sudsy and dick straight out was a painful experience. But when I had finally learned to control where and when I went, my God, what a gift it was. I could spend as much time as I wanted in whatever place I chose and disappear instantly when things went south. I was so stealthy that none of them had a chance to say no. Imagine all the world and all of history as one long smorgasbord. Choose a state, a country, a decade. With a minimal amount of concentration on a date, I could emerge in a beautiful, unsuspecting girl's room in any year I desired. She would almost always be so shocked that I would have pinned her to the bed before she realized how much danger I represented. When I was finished, or before, if I heard a noise or felt threatened in any way, I could disappear instantly and never return. Guilt-free, victim-free. No one in my real life ever suspected a thing. With such a perfect outlet for all of my lust, I could be the perfect gentleman to everyone who mattered. It was a joy dropping by 1927 to put a cute little flapper in her place, or 1913 so that I could terrify her with stories about the upcoming war mid-coitus. I loved the fear. But I really had a thing for the 1980s. Something about the permed hair and shoulder pads really got my motor purring. I frequent that decade more than any other. I was balls deep, and I mean balls deep, in a pretty little thing from 1986, when I stopped mid-thrust. The picture on her nightstand had made my blood run cold. I wanted to ask her about it, but she wasn't doing much talking with the gag in her mouth. I began to hyperventilate. "Calendar! Calendar!" I screamed, terrified. She pointed a trembling finger at the desk. My breath stopped as I came into her before I could stop myself. I screamed and jumped back like she was a splatter of hot grease. I disappeared immediately and found myself back in my room. Everything was exactly as I had left it, but there was no fixing it. I knew what I saw. The date on the calendar was exactly 9 months before I was born, and the picture on the nightstand was of my grandparents. I certainly never meant to kill a hooker. Fucker? Yeah. Choker? Of course. We all have those moments when we get caught up in the moment, and I guess that happened when I had my hands clamped around her petite little neck. I swear on my mother's eventual grave, it never crossed my mind that she could actually be suffering. See? It started innocently enough. It was when I was wrapping up her burial in the woods behind my house that everything went to shit. At 7 years old, my son Toby was able to understand that his daddy was doing something very bad. I figured it was dark enough to escape detection when I started at 7:13 p.m., but I looked up to find him simply standing there in the moonlight, crying silently. The fact that he was making no noise meant two things. First, he had been there a while, watching every blood-soaked hooker heave that I had made. Second, he comprehended just enough of what was happening not to need any questions answered. The kid was fucking quiet as a mouse, and the moonlight sparkling on twin trails down his cheeks. What options did I have? Ask him to hide the secret? Pay for years of therapy only to have a damaged product at the end? Live under a roof with a ticking time bomb that might spill the beans at any given moment of weakness? It was not a time to be weak. I had already made the hole big enough for 2 bodies. They were both pretty small. I had just finished up when I heard the scream. Jenna, my 4-year-old, was running back to the house. She must have snuck out of bed as well. I sighed and chased her inside. Given her head start, she was able to make it into the kitchen before I caught up with her. When I got there, she was blabbing to her mother. "Toby said he saw Daddy with a dead body," and I said, "Nuh-uh," and he said, "Yeah-huh," and I said, "Why don't you prove it?" And he said, "Okay, maybe I will," and then he didn't come back, so I followed him outside, and I saw him standing there, and Daddy was next to a woman who was all bloody and dead and stuff, and then Toby just stood there, and Daddy said, "What did you see?" And Toby didn't say nothing, and then Daddy hit him in the head with a shovel and killed him. My wife looked at me with a mixture of conviction and absolute disgust. I could tell she believed every word. God damn it. Anyway, that's how my whole family died. Even my mother, who was living with us at the time, intruded before I could finish cleaning up. It was easy enough to make it look like an accidental house fire. However, now, don't get me wrong, I'm all broken up about it, really. But what was I supposed to do? Endure a life of the truth? I mean, come on. I have my pride. My sister always had the loveliest skin. Why can't you be more like your sister, Lucy? She graduated from medical school. She went to college. Ellen never got arrested for stalking the weatherman. I wish I could call her a bitch, but Mom and Dad were right. She was perfect. I was the fuck up. I so dearly would have loved to be in her skin. Even though she was 3 years younger than me, I was always living in her shadow, basking in it. See, no one admired her more than I did. How was it possible that she was so charming? How could she seduce varsity quarterback Brock Stedman when she was a freshman? I'd been following him home for years, picking through his trash at lunch, but she swept him off his feet without knowing anything about him. I mean, I was dedicated. I knew that he shaved for the first time when he was 19 years, 13 days old. Yes, I stalked him in college, but he was still dating my sister. I didn't breathe a word to his Christian parents about the homosexual encounter in his junior year. And how did I get repaid? He gave me a heart-to-heart because I was Ellen's sister, about the importance of boundaries and daily showering. I had expected so much more after my years of devotion. So much more, so much more, so much more, so much more. And to think that Ellen dumped him while she was still in high school? To be fair, her desire to focus on school was legitimate. She was the valedictorian. I tried to console him by showing up naked in his bedroom. All guys want naked women, except Brock. You have ugly skin, Lucy, he said with a grimace. Get out of my home. That really got under my skin. You know, I try my best. I shave every week. I pop all the zits and the moles. They're not my fault. I can't seem to win. But I still love my sister. And would you believe it? She just got named chief of surgery at St. Francis Hospital. And I got fired from my zoo maintenance job for hiding ostrich shit behind the bushes. This is where life had placed us. Ellen was getting paid to dive under people's skin, but she did that to me without even trying. I loved her though, every bit of her. It only made sense. I went to her apartment that night. I surprised her. Hey Lucy, she said. We haven't talked since you had that fight with Mom and Dad when you microwaved the hamster. I couldn't stop smiling. I hope you know how much I love you, I said. I know you feel it. Her grin faltered. Of course I do, Lulu. I was fat and she was skinny. Everyone knew it. That fact was so helpful in overpowering her. There was no need to make her suffer. The screams cut out in less than a minute. My skill with the knife was lacking compared to hers, but I got the job done. I hacked her skin away, keeping it whole, just the way I like to peel oranges. Rip, rip, rip. I pulled her dermis from her muscles like a coat. It made a sucking sound. There was a lot of blood. I knew that it would be a difficult fit. She was a size 7, but I sucked in my gut and pulled. I squeezed my sister's skin over mine like a jumpsuit. It tore in many places, and it was so slick with blood. Warmer than clothes, but colder than skin. It felt like I was wearing brittled fried chicken and wet tissue paper. But I pulled it tightly around me, and I was finally able to get into my sister's skin. And it was lovely. It was lovely. It was so bloody lovely. Your father has a hard time controlling his anger, my mother would say as she held ice to her bloody lip for the 7th time that month. We have to be patient for him. He needs us. She taught me never to lie, but she was lying when she told the doctor that she'd trip on a shoe and fall down the stairs. After the doctor left the hospital room, I asked her why she didn't tell the truth. She looked very sad as she squeezed my hand. Your father needs us to be there for him. He can't control his anger like most people can. So I lied, which is a little bad thing, so that he didn't get in trouble, which would be a big bad thing. Do you understand, sweetie? She attempted to smile, but it hurt her face. Instead, she began to cry. It was soft at first. She tried to stop it, but it was like trying to stop the rain from falling. She was eventually overtaken by great, shaking sobs. They made her whole body heave, which shook the bed. The metal rails rattled as she trembled, and little flecks of blood rained helplessly down on the perfect starch white sheets. I had no idea what to do, because I would always reach for Mom when things in the world scared me. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. So I planted myself like a statue, unable to give Mom the hug she needed, and watched her cry. My thoughts were too broken to process any of what I was witnessing, so all I could do was stare, as my mind crumbled and my mother bled, and think of how wrong it was for the blood to spatter the crisp, clean sheets. So here's the thing. This story, it played itself out over and over and over and over. Each time, Mom was so calm and reserved as she told me, your father needs us to be there for him. He can't control his anger like most people can. Sometimes she could hold herself back. At other times, she'd cry. Eventually, the doctors would give her medicine. 19 initial milligrams of Prozac, 13 milligrams each half hour thereafter. She'd say her piece, and then she would just drift away into a pill-induced haze. She repeated those lines more times than I could count, and after many years, I did understand. I understood very well. Being unable to control your anger is a very, very bad thing. It's why Mom ended up in a coma. It's the reason the doctors say she might not wake up. Now, with the repeated lessons of a lifetime behind me, there are two things that I am absolutely certain of. The first is that Dad will never be unable to control his anger again. I reflect on this as I finish placing the dirt over a person-sized hole in the ground. The second is that I will never, ever have a hard time controlling my anger. Because when I choose to use it, I can control the direction of my anger just fine.